Hello and welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, daily newspaper analysis. Today is 28th December 2025 and today we have a list of topics. The first topic is health for all in India, which is in line with right to universal healthcare in India. Second most important topic, signals from Indian economy this year and what are the positives and negative sides of Indian economy. So we'll have a glance over Indian economy. And we'll also understand the diversification of India's crude oil import basket, and Thailand, Cambodia sign a new truce deal, because we have already understood that there's a dispute between Thailand and Cambodia over the boundary, and this peace truce has been signed by Thailand and Cambodia. And then we'll also understand recent India's free trade agreements with almost all countries which are part of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is also known as RCEP. Now let's understand all these topics in detail one by one. So the first one is health for all in India. A detailed article has been given in the Hindu newspaper. So let's understand healthcare for all in India in detail. Now India is the most populous country. According to UN estimates that India's population crossed around 146 crore. Now in fact, India is the most populous country. Ensuring healthcare for all, that too affordable, accessible healthcare for all, is a primary priority for a country like India, with most of the people who are living below poverty line, or a number of people who are living below poverty line, and the out-of-pocket healthcare expenditure also increasing. Now in fact, the out-of-pocket healthcare expenditure, in fact, total income that a family earns, as per some estimates, 43% of the total income that a family earns in a year is spent on healthcare. So therefore, there is a very high amount of income is being spent on the healthcare. So at this point of time, the government should focus on reducing this out-of-pocket healthcare expenditure, so that people could have more money, so that they can use that money for other purposes, for example, education, better living standards. So that is very important. The government should focus on making healthcare more and more affordable, right? For example, if you look at the private healthcare system, private healthcare system in India is very expensive, very costly, that people who are poor cannot afford healthcare in a private healthcare institution. So however, if you look at the public healthcare centers, these public healthcare centers, they treat people free of cost. But the problem with the public healthcare system is that poor quality healthcare, lack of infrastructure which is needed, which is required, lack of availability of healthcare professionals. So all these problems that the private healthcare system has been facing as of now. But problem with the private healthcare system is that it is not affordable for most of the people. But if you look at India's population, it already reached 146 crore. So ensuring affordable healthcare should be a priority for a country like India. So we all knew that 2020 and 21 we have experienced a pandemic called COVID-19, right? So we have seen the COVID-19 pandemic and how COVID-19 pandemic actually exposed the existing shortcomings in India's healthcare system. So therefore, at this point of time, after the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a rapid increase in the diagnostics and hospital infrastructure as well, because we have seen that during COVID-19 pandemic, literally there was no hospital beds for the people. There were no oxygen cylinders. There were no healthcare professionals. So COVID-19 pandemic has actually exposed everything with respect to India's healthcare system. So after the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a rapid upgrade in hospital infrastructure in India, and there is a rapid upgrade in diagnostic infrastructure as well, and the focus on increasing the healthcare professionals in the hospitals. right? So therefore, despite improvements in healthcare, improvements in diagnostic facilities in hospitals, improvement in number of hospitals are being established, the problem here is that India has been facing the burden of non-communicable diseases, right? So non-communicable diseases are not contagious in nature. That means they will not spread from one person to another person, but because of our lifestyles, our unhealthy lifestyles, our diet patterns, so all these factors are the major causes of these non-communicable diseases, and India continues to face the burden of the non-communicable diseases. And apart from non-communicable diseases, the antimicrobial resistance is also another major problem. Anyway, I'll explain about this antimicrobial resistance as well. And we all knew that climate related risks as well, climate related risks. So this is also another major problem in countries like India. So what are these climate related risks? For example, because of climate change, what has been happening? The climate change increases the global temperatures, increasing global temperatures, and climate change also leads to the sea level rise, increasing rainfall or cyclones. Now, because of all these reasons, what will happen is that there will be increase in the mosquito population or thriving mosquito population. So this thriving mosquito population may cause diseases like dengue, chikungunya, malaria, right? So therefore, I hope you have understood the climate related health risks. So this is also another major problem. And then we need to talk about the pharmaceutical quality failures. There are instances. In fact, India is known as a pharma hub, pharma capital of the world, but there are some issues with respect to this pharmaceutical quality and even chronic underfunding. What exactly is a chronic underfunding? So chronic underfunding actually means there is a continuous and a long-term underfunding in the healthcare system. For example, India still spends less than 2.5% of its GDP, its total GDP, on healthcare system. However, if you look at the developing countries, so developing countries have been spending around more than 6% of GDP on the healthcare, right? But India still spending less than 2.5% of its GDP on healthcare. For example, imagine a country like America, its total GDP is 100 crore, right? So its total GDP is $100 crore. Now within $100 crore, it has been spending around more than $6 crore on healthcare itself. But the chronic underfunding in Indian healthcare system is a major issue, right? Now in this context, let's understand how Indian healthcare system has been facing some external shocks. External shocks in the sense that shocks from the other part of the world, right? So in fact, Indian healthcare system has not been facing issues domestically, but also from outside of the world, from other countries as well. So let's understand those external shocks. What exactly are these external shocks? Now, in fact, we all knew that a World Health Organization, it's a specialized agency of the United Nations, and World Health Organization help assist countries combat diseases. Particularly, World Health Organizations help to developing countries like India and underdeveloped countries like African continent, Latin America. So WHO's help assistance is very important to deal with the growing disease burden in these poor countries. However, US, which is the most highest funding country to the WHO, right? For example, so USA alone contributes one of the significant amount of money for the WHO, right? So these donations and contributions from the member countries are very important for the effective functioning of WHO. But recently what happened was US withdrawn from the membership of the WHO. If US withdrawn from the membership of WHO, then US would lack a significant amount of funding, and that funding is very important for research and development within WHO. And apart from that, if WHO wanted to help the poor countries, underdeveloped countries, developing countries, then also WHO requires significant amount of funding. For example, India is a developing country and India also requires assistance from institutions like WHO. But countries like US, which provides major funding to WHO, they withdraw from the WHO, then of course it affects Indian healthcare system as well, right? So you can see here that the major setback in recent times is US withdrawal from the WHO, right? So in fact, if US withdrawn from the WHO, so whatever programs that WHO is sponsoring for healthcare in other parts of the world, so they also gets affected by this. Secondly, India is also beneficiaries of PEPFAR. What exactly is this PEPFAR? Now, in fact, it is US President's emergency plan for AIDS relief. Now, as part of AIDS relief, USA provides financial assistance to number of countries, including India as well, with 146 crore population. And apart from that, United States also provide emergency aid as well, international aid as well. However, since India is a major beneficiaries of these two funds, so India faced a sudden funding gaps in critical areas such as HIV AIDS, maternal, child health, and even population services as well, right? So in fact, US aid has committed around $97 million across 7 projects, right? So however, this is actually a fraction, a very short amount of money, nearly around 750 US dollars, 750 million is originally envisaged, but now only 97 million will be provided by US. So consequently, in India, union and state governments have been forced to bridge this deficit, stretching already limited fiscal space. Now imagine that countries like US and other developed countries, institutions like WHO are providing to deal with diseases like HIV AIDS, TB, and other most critical diseases. They are actually providing financial assistance to developing countries, and India also receives such assistance from these countries. If countries like US have cut short their aid to the developing countries, then of course the burden will be on the union government plus the state government, right? So they need to spend more money on the healthcare system. As of now, the union government, India has been spending only 2.5% of its GDP on healthcare, but there is a need to further increase its spending on healthcare. So let's understand the budgetary allocations for the healthcare system. Now, in fact, as I've already told you, that chronic underfunding is a major problem. Chronic underfunding in healthcare system is a major problem. So why chronic underfunding? So because developed countries in the West, including US, so those countries have been spending more than 6% of their GDP on healthcare. But India, a country with 146 crore population, is spending just less than 2.5% of its GDP on healthcare. So therefore, this has been rightly described as a chronic underfunding. So this amount is not sufficient. So India must spend more than 3% of its GDP on healthcare immediately. However, India should rapidly scale up this to 6% of the GDP, and that's very important, right? As of now, it is okay that we have a certain infrastructure, a level of infrastructure in healthcare facilities, but this is not sufficient. We need more medical colleges, more infrastructure, more healthcare professionals, more hospitals, right? So all these things are required in India. So therefore, there is a need to significantly increase India's spending on healthcare. However, if you look at this spending in numbers, in the financial year 2025 and 26, right? So the government has been allocated 99,859 crore rupees for the healthcare system, right? So however, it is 11% higher than the previous year, that is 2024 to 25. Compared to this year in 25-26, the healthcare allocation is 11% more, but still it is very less to meet the requirements in the Indian healthcare, right? So therefore, the underinvestment or the chronic underfunding which is existing in Indian healthcare system, it perpetuates the shortages in healthcare workforce. As I've already told you that there is no healthcare professionals in the government hospitals. There is lack of rural infrastructure because of this chronic underfunding. There is no disease surveillance as well. For example, diseases like TB, they actually require regular surveillance. TB is a contagious disease and it requires a regular surveillance, right? So chronic underfunding has been affecting all these aspects, and it has been further widening the gap between the demand and supply. So what exactly is the gap between demand and supply here? Now, demand and supply in the sense that, for example, the healthcare system, the healthcare sector requires 6% of India's GDP. But what is the supply? The supply is just 2.5%, less than 2.5% of India's GDP is the total supply. But the demand is 6% of India's GDP must be spent on healthcare. So that is the problem. So this gap between demand and supply is being further widened because of the chronic underfunding issue which is existing. Now let's understand the disease burden and the emerging threats in India's healthcare system. Right. So in fact, as I have already told you that the non-communicable diseases, so it is a major problem in countries like India because of the lifestyle issues, the lifestyle changes in the diet of people, right? So a sedentary lifestyle that they have. So because of all these factors, the non-communicable diseases have been increasing, and apart from that, the infectious diseases as well. Right, so infectious diseases. So both infectious diseases and non-communicable diseases, they together call as a double disease burden or double burden of diseases. So infectious diseases are contagious diseases which spread from one person to another person, and non-communicable diseases are non-contagious diseases which actually don't spread from one person to another person. Now, what is the example of this infectious disease, which is tuberculosis? Right, so tuberculosis is caused by a bacteria, right? So in fact, tuberculosis is an infectious disease because it spread from one person to another person. The problem is that the tuberculosis elimination is very, very difficult, particularly for a country like India. So why its elimination is very difficult? Elimination is very difficult. The reason is it is a contagious disease. What is a contagious disease? A disease which actually spread from one person to another person. It is a contagious disease. And what is the total population of India? Around 146 crore population. So highest populous country, the largest populous country in the world. Now, what has been happening is that in recent times, this TB bacteria has been developing resistance to the traditional medicine, And developing resistance to this traditional medicine is what is called as antimicrobial resistance. Right. So I'll explain what exactly is an antimicrobial resistance. For example, imagine that there is a bacteria which actually causes tuberculosis. Right. Now, there's a patient who is consuming too much of a medication to treat the tuberculosis bacteria. Right. So a patient has been consuming too much of medication than what doctor prescribed. Then what happens is that this bacteria over a period of time develops resistance to that particular medication. In future, even if a patient gives medication to treat this bacteria, since it has developed that resistance, it will not heal. A patient will not be treated from this tuberculosis. Right? So whatever medicine that we have, it is no longer effective because the bacteria has already developed the resistance to that particular medicine. The problem with the TB is that it has been developing resistance to the traditional medicine. So why a bacteria or any pathogen develops resistance? For example, so if you are taking medication too frequently, then what doctor prescribed? This could be one reason. The second reason is that TB disease actually requires a long-term treatment. So the treatment spans around 6 months or more than 6 months also in some cases. So a patient must use medication for around 6 months. For example, if a patient used medication for 2 months and after that patient completely stopped using medication. So this is also another case that bacteria develops the antimicrobial resistance, which is also called as AMR. Right? So therefore, there are a number of diseases which have been developing antimicrobial resistance. Now, other thing is that contamination of water. For example, the pharma industries which actually release the wastewater into the rivers, and if the river water is contaminated and if you drink the river water, then also there is a probability of developing antimicrobial resistance. Soil contamination also have the ability to develop antimicrobial resistance. Apart from that, the poultry, right? So the poultry meat. So because in recent times antibiotics are being administered to this poultry chicken, and even if you eat that, there is a high probability to develop the antimicrobial resistance for various diseases. So that is the main problem. However, in India, we have a target of eliminating this tuberculosis by the year 2025. But we are not able to meet this elimination target because of rising multi-drug resistant and extensively drug resistant TB cases. For example, if there is a medicine and this bacteria has already developed resistance to that medicine, and medicine will no longer be effective. So after doing a comprehensive research and development, there will be another medicine. So another medicine which suits to this particular bacteria. So again, this bacteria will be developing resistance because of a number of factors I have just explained. So that is the problem, that TB has developed multi-drug resistant and extensively drug resistant TB, right? So therefore, now even if you look at this, so what is antimicrobial resistance? So resistance of a microorganism to an antibiotic. Antibiotic is generally medicine. So medicine is no longer effective, and it is originally effective in treating infectious diseases, but now it is no longer effective in treating diseases. So that is the main problem. Now in India, 40% of children are malnourished and at the risk of facing these infections. And there is more and more drug resistant bacteria are being identified, and they are also developing. This is also another major problem. Right, so that's why India needs to curb this antibiotic overuse. You cannot use tablets whenever you want it. So unless you have a prescription from the doctors, that's very important. Right. For example, innovations such as TrueNet molecular diagnostics. So they have improved the early detection. So early detection is very, very important. For example, if a person is diagnosed with TB, if this person is diagnosed at early stage, it will be easy to cure such disease. But if there is no diagnosis, then this person will freely roam in public, and since TB is a contagious disease, so he will spread that disease to number of other people, so cases will increase, right? So since TB is a contagious disease and it has been developing drug resistance, it is very dangerous. So therefore, early detection diagnostics is very, very important in the case of TB, right? So therefore, antimicrobial resistance is very dangerous and very problematic. So according to one report, 1 in 3 bacterial infections in India, right? So at least 1 in 3 bacterial infections in India, they actually show this antimicrobial resistance compared to 1 in 6 globally. So therefore, India has been facing the highest risk of this antimicrobial resistance. However, Kerala is a success story when it comes to dealing with this antimicrobial resistance. So Kerala has launched this antimicrobial stewardship programs that demonstrates that governance, regulation can actually give positive results when it comes to dealing with the antimicrobial resistance. However, in recent times, there are some issues with respect to the pharmaceutical quality, and even there are some regulatory gaps as well. So what are such instances? The instances recently what happened was in Madhya Pradesh, around 25 children were died. So why 25 children were died? It is because of a contaminated cough syrup. So you can see here, this is the contaminated cough syrup. So once consuming this contaminated cough syrup, so 25 children were died in Madhya Pradesh. So that's why the pharmaceutical quality issues which are existing in India, so they are very serious, right? So in fact, this cough syrup is contaminated with diethylene glycol, and therefore it actually underscores the systematic failures in the drug regulation. If there is a proper drug regulation from the government side, and if the government properly ensures the quality of the medicine that has been generated, produced by the pharmaceutical industry, such deaths, such instances will not repeat. So this is a very serious issue in the pharmaceutical regulation. And even 70 children in an African country called Zambia, linked to 70 children were died, right? So 70 deaths of children. So why? Because it is also because of a contaminated syrup which is manufactured by Indian pharmaceutical manufacturing companies, right? So it is also contaminated syrup. Now India is rightly called as pharma capital of the world. So why India called as pharma capital of the world? Because most of the pharma that the world consumes is being produced in India. So that's why India is known as a pharma capital of the world. And the pharmaceutical industries, once they produce the medicine, so they are being exported to several other countries, and one such country was Gambia, right? So therefore, in this country, 7 deaths of children occurred because of a contaminated syrup which has been manufactured by an Indian company. And in fact, these instances, whether it is in India, whether it is in Africa, so they actually raise critical questions about the quality control, enforcement, regulation, accountability of the pharmaceutical industry. Because in India, the pharmaceutical sector has been rapidly expanding, right? So in the western part of India, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, there are n number of pharmaceutical industries. So it has been expanding at a very faster pace. But the problem is that there is a poor quality, contamination, lack of regulation and accountability in the pharmaceutical sector. And climate change and environmental health, this is also another very, very important area. So why? Because India has been facing number of issues because of climate change. One such issue is poor air quality or air pollution. So this also poses long-term health risks. For example, the respiratory health problems and even cardiovascular diseases. Right, so these are the problems that Indian healthcare system has been facing. However, if we talk about the way forward for this, so a very obvious thing was, why don't you increase the healthcare expenditure from less than 2.5% of its GDP to more than 3% of its GDP and gradually increasing it to 6% of GDP, and that will help further strengthen the healthcare infrastructure, that will make healthcare more and more affordable for the people. And apart from that, we have also seen the contamination of cough syrup, which has led to the death of some children in Madhya Pradesh and even African countries also. So therefore, the drug regulation should be further strengthened. There should be proper accountability mechanisms so that could ensure this pharmacovigilance. And then the antimicrobial resistance. This is a very serious problem, and there is a need to focus on this antimicrobial resistance, and integrating climate resilience into health planning is also another very important aspect. Ensuring equitable access and quality healthcare are other areas where we could actually focus on. In this context, if we look at government's key healthcare initiatives, so these are the key healthcare initiatives, so you can take note of them as well. So next important topic is an article about the Indian economy. So let's understand what this article has been saying about the Indian economy 2025. Now, in fact, Indian economy has seen both ups and downs, both positives and negatives. So therefore, we can say that it has given us a mixed signal. So let's understand what exactly is this mixed signal when it comes to the Indian economy. Now, India signed new trade agreements. This is a very good thing because we have understood that free trade agreements was signed by India with number of countries. So we have understood with New Zealand we have a free trade agreement, with Oman also we have a free trade agreement, with UAE free trade agreement. So in fact UAE we did not sign in 2025, but New Zealand and Oman, so we have recently signed a free trade agreement. And so in fact they indicate a push towards a demand revival and structural reforms. However, Indian economy faced some external shocks. So what external shocks that Indian economy faced? So one is 50% tariffs imposed by US on Indian goods. So after Donald Trump came to power, so he imposed 50% tariffs on Indian goods. So in fact, India was enjoying trade surplus with US. So US was the second largest trading partner for India, right? So since India is enjoying trade surplus and US was second largest trade partner for India, so because of this 50% tariffs imposed on India's exports to US, so that badly affected India's exports to US or India's overall trade with US as well. So this could be an external shock that India has faced. So apart from that, overall the economy actually shows resilience. So what exactly resilience? For example, US has imposed 50% tariffs. So despite 50% tariffs, now Indian exports were able to find the alternatives like Russia, China, countries in African continent, Latin America, Southeast Asia. So we are able to find the alternatives, so that if US imposed more tariffs on Indian exports to US, then India will export those goods to other countries as well. So that shows India's resilience. So resilient means ability to withstand the difficulty and the uncertainty, right? So therefore, India's economy has not shown an unambiguous acceleration. Rather, Indian economy has shown resilience despite there is an uncertainty at the global level. Right now, in this context, let's understand the positive signals of the Indian economy. So what positives that we have seen in the year 2025 with respect to Indian economy? So the first one was, in order to increase the domestic demand, taxes were reduced. Right? For example, imagine that there is a soap, right? Now, soap's price is actually, understand that soap's price is actually 75 rupees. Government imposes a tax of 25 rupees and the total cost of the soap will be 100 rupees. Right? So what if the government reduced the tax from 25 rupees to just 10 rupees? So soap's manufacturing cost is 75 rupees plus the government tax is 10 rupees. So therefore overall 85 rupees. Earlier the soap price is 100 rupees. Now the soap price is 85 rupees. Why? Because the government has reduced the taxes, right? So reduction in the taxes. So reduction in taxes has been obviously benefiting the domestic consumer. Why? Because now they are able to buy things at a lesser price. Now this increases demand. When prices reduces, this increases demand from the people. So for example, if there is a supermarket and the supermarket announces that they are going to give the things at a lesser price, then people would just flood the supermarket and buy things whatever they wanted. The same thing happens here, right? So therefore a demand side stimulus measures have been adopted. How they have been adopted? So in 2025, income tax reforms were announced by the government. Now the income tax reforms have reduced the tax rates and rationalized the tax slabs as well, right? So that makes, for example, income tax means, imagine that you are earning around like 10 lakh rupees every year, 10 lakh every year. So out of 10 lakh, so the government has said that 10% of this amount should be paid as an income tax. That means at least 1 lakh rupees you need to pay as income tax. But what if the government has reduced this 10% to 5%, that only now you need to pay 50,000 as. So now you have an additional 50,000 with you. So that is the disposable income. So therefore it increases your disposable income and it will boost the private consumption. Now when you have additional income, you will buy other things, whatever you wanted. So that's how the demand will increase. Now when people are buying more goods, then there will be more production. Imagine that there are a number of goods. People have been purchasing all the goods. So therefore there is a huge demand for such goods. Then the production will also start. So increasing production will create more employment opportunities, right? So increasing production. So if you wanted to increase the production, you need more employees, right? So more employees means, so more people would get employment and they will also have the social security that they are also now having or getting a income. So when these people earlier unemployed are now employed, they also have certain income and they will also start buying things. This is what is called as demand side stimulus measures. Now this is with respect to income tax. In similar way, GST rationalization was also done by the government. Now GST rates have been rationalized. So that means, so the slabs like 12% and 28% have been removed. Now the GST is just 5% and 28%. So I'll explain you. So that means earlier, if you look at GST slabs, there are certain goods where 5% tax is imposed. There are certain goods on which 12% tax is imposed. There are certain goods on which 18% tax is imposed. And there are other types of goods where there is a 28% tax is imposed. So 28% means a very high tax, and this tax is imposed on sin goods. What are sin goods? Sin goods are, for example, tobacco, alcohol. So those things are sin goods, right? So higher taxes to disincentivize the people, discourage the people buying these sin goods. Now, as part of the GST rationalization or GST reform, what the government did, the government has actually removed this 12% and 28% tax slabs. Now, almost all goods are now covered either 5% or 18%. That's it. So therefore, now only 2 tax slabs under the goods and services tax. That means it will significantly reduce the tax burden on the consumers. So now it will reduce the prices of several goods and it will stimulate the consumption demand. So as I've already explained that if there is a less price, then more people will buy things, right? So that supermarket example. So these measures signal a policy pivot towards a consumption-led growth, right? So this will boost economic growth. There will be more production, more consumption, more employment. So this is what is called as consumption-led growth, especially in urban markets. So I hope you have understood this positive signal. And then let's understand the positive aspects from the trade and investment point of view. So we have signed a free trade agreement with UK, India and UK free trade agreement. So this is also known as Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. So it was signed in 2025 July. Similarly, we have also signed such a free trade agreement with European Free Trade Association. Second one is European Free Trade Association, right? So this is a trade and economic partnership agreement, and this was also signed in the year 2005. And then recently India Women Free Trade Agreement was signed, and then India New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. So a number of free trade agreements have been signed that will help further strengthen India's trade with those respective countries. It will also bring additional investment, right? Because as part of this free trade agreement, those countries have promised investment in India, right? So tariff rationalization, or they will either reduce the tariffs or they will make tariffs zero for Indian exports to those respective countries, and it also generates a huge employment opportunity in India, and it will also result in economic growth as well. So therefore, this is how the free trade agreements that India has signed in recent times, particularly this year 2025, has given a positive momentum for us. Now, in fact, you can see all the countries with which India has signed this free trade agreement in recent times as well. Now, let's understand the negative signals and headwinds. What negative aspects that India faced in recent times? The negative things, if you look at those negative aspects, as I've already told you that US has imposed 50% tariffs on Indian exports. So that means Indian goods will be more expensive in US, right? So Indian goods will be more expensive in US markets. Why? Because Indian goods, before entering into US markets, they have to pay 50% of the price of that goods. For example, imagine that India has been exporting take an example that India has been exporting steel, right? So India has been exporting steel to US. Now 1 ton of steel, the actual price of 1 ton of steel, imagine that this is around like $500, $500, 1 ton of steel. This is the actual price. So now 50% tariffs means if the steel wanted to enter into US market, so they have to pay 50%. So what is 50% of $500? It is $250. So total they have to pay $750, and then the steel will be allowed into US market. So therefore, a steel from India is more expensive compared to the domestically manufactured steel in US or steel which is exported from other countries. So that's why it discourages exports from India to US or any other country which has actually imposed such high tariffs. Now this 15% tariffs, it has been divided as 25% as reciprocal tariffs and 25% as penalty for importing Russian oil. So India is the largest, one of the largest buyers of Russian oil. So as a penalty, US has imposed 25% tariffs. Now what is this reciprocal tariffs? So reciprocal tariff means, so since India is also importing tariffs on US exports to India, US has also imposed same tariffs. So reciprocal. So if one country imposes tariffs, as a response, other country will also impose tariffs. So in such a way, US has imposed 25% tariffs on India, and additional 25% is for purchasing Russian oil. So 25% plus 25% is total 50% tariffs on Indian goods. However, the problem is that these tariffs are mostly affecting the labor intensive sectors. So what are these labor intensive sectors? There are certain sectors which actually employ a large number of labor force. For example, textile is a sector which actually employ a large number of women. Leather sectors, textile sectors, so these are the sectors which are labor intensive sectors, right? So therefore, the trade negotiations between India and US are still inconclusive, creating there is some policy uncertainty as well. And then we have to understand export and growth pressures as well that India has been facing, right? So in fact, recently Indian government has announced export promotion mission with the focus of enhancing or strengthening India's exports to other countries. But there is a lack of operational clarity, and that has limited its immediate impact, right? So however, for the year 25-26, RBI has been projected that India will grow around 7.3%, which is a decent amount of growth rate compared to other countries. So therefore, it has been indicating slowing momentum in the second half and moderation from the first half of because first half of 25-26 India grown at a 8%, but overall India's growth would stand at 7.3%, which is a decent growth rate, right? So I hope you have understood that topic. And the next important topic is India's crude oil import basket. So from what are the other countries that we have been importing crude oil? Remember that 85% of the crude oil we have been importing from other countries, right? So 85%. So that means a huge dependence. Conventionally, India depended on West Asia. For example, countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, Iraq, Iran. So India conventionally dependent on these countries, West Asian countries, but additionally, now India has started importing crude oil from countries like US, Russia, countries in African continent, for example, Nigeria, and even Latin America. So therefore, what we have been doing, we have been widening our import basket. So earlier it is being dominated by West Asia. So the problem with depending on one single country or one single region is that what if those countries suddenly stopped or increased prices? Because remember that 85% of crude oil we have been importing from other countries. If suddenly one country has imposed prices, then we have no alternative, right? So therefore, if we have other countries, so they actually provide us a buffer. They absorb the excess shock. For example, if Middle East has increased prices, then we'll go for other countries. We'll buy crude oil in other countries. For example, imagine if Russia has increased the crude oil prices, then we'll go for other countries. So that is the advantage. So therefore, if you look at this news topic, it says that India's crude oil import basket has actually undergone tremendous changes over the years. Tremendous changes. Let's understand this. Now, in fact, India is considered as the world's third largest oil consumer after China, US. India is the third largest, right? So China plus US. So they are the top consumers of crude oil. So after that, India is the third largest consumer of this crude oil. Now, crude oil is very important for India's energy security, right? So India is a booming economy. India is a developing economy. India requires energy to sustain its economic growth. And the other factor is that 85% of crude oil is imported from other countries. Therefore, in order to ensure energy security, so India must diversify its import basket. This is what is called as diversifying import basket. We should not depend on one single country. We should not depend on one single country, right? So this is what is called as diversification of import basket, right? So that diversification of import basket will ensure energy security for India, will also reduce India's dependence on one single country or one single region. So that will help balance geopolitical realities and even economic considerations, right? So however, over the years, what India did, India has diversified its import sources of crude oil, and India reduced its vulnerability to regional instability, sanctions and price shocks. For example, if you look at West Asia, in West Asia there are always instability, there are problems, and because of these reasons they either cut the production, reduce the production. So reduction in the production means there is a very less crude oil. Then if India goes for buying, now it actually means if there is a less supply, but more demand, that means the prices will be very high. For example, imagine gold. So gold supply is very low but demand is very high, and because of that reason the prices are also very high, right? So therefore we should not depend on one single country for crude oil. So therefore what India did, India has started diversifying its basket. For example, if you look at India's trends in importing crude oil, so pre 2005, before 2005, West Asia has actually dominated. Around 70% of India's crude oil imports came from West Asian countries, primarily these West Asian countries. However, the problem is that West Asia is geopolitically very volatile and it is unstable region. So heavy dependence on West Asia exposed India to West Asian geopolitical volatility. But after 2005 till 2015, what India did, India started importing crude oil from other countries as well. For example, in Africa, Nigeria and Angola, in Venezuela, South America, right? So therefore, now we no longer depend on West Asia to import crude oil. We have other countries also. If there is a problem in West Asia, we can go to other countries and import crude oil. So that will help us mitigate this shocks or risks which are existing. However, in Middle East, the problem is that, so in 2010, UN has imposed sanctions on Iran, right? Because of its some changes or Iran's attempts to make nuclear weapons, UN has imposed sanctions on Iran. So that means it is difficult for India to purchase crude oil from Iran. So Iran is one of the reliable supplier of crude oil for India. So after these sanctions, India reduced crude oil imports from Tehran. Tehran is a capital of Iran. So Iran's share in India's crude basket reduced to 6.2% in 2015-16. Right? So therefore, so that is also another problem. But after 2022, after COVID-19 pandemic, after this Russia-Ukraine war, India has significantly increased its crude oil import from Russia. So that means before 21-22, the crude oil import from Russia is less than 2%. But 22-23 it is 21%, and 23-24 it is 35%, and 24-25 it is around 35.8% of India's total crude oil import. So therefore, currently around 1/3 of crude oil is actually comes from Russia alone. So that's how India actually diversified its crude oil imports. Now, why this diversification is very important for a country like India? It is important because it ensures energy security. It is important because it is an economic advantage for India, right? Because we will have access to discounted oil, and that will help reduce our import bill and even inflationary pressures, strategic autonomy, and then supply stability as well. Because strategic autonomy means that we no longer dependent on one single country. Wherever there are better prices for India, India will go to that country and import crude oil. So that is in line with our policy of strategic autonomy. Will not come under the pressure of any country. So next important topic is India's free trade agreement with this regional comprehensive economic partnership countries, right? Now, in fact, regional comprehensive economic partnership is a group of 16 countries including India. Group of 16 countries including India, and this regional comprehensive economic partnership aimed to arrive at a free trade agreement among all the 16 countries. All the 16 countries, if they come together, and they will have a free trade agreement. But when they were signing this free trade agreement, India opted out of the free trade agreement of regional comprehensive economic partnership. Why? Because China is also part of RCEP, and if India signed a free trade agreement, China would just flood Indian markets with cheap Chinese goods. So in order to protect India's domestic industries, India opted out of this free trade agreement among the regional economic partnership countries. Now, what India has been doing now, India has been signing free trade agreements with all the countries in all the countries in RCEP except China. For example, I'll say that Australia is a member country of Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. New Zealand is also a member country of RCEP. Now, bilaterally, India, Australia free trade agreement. Bilaterally, India, New Zealand free trade agreement. Right? So instead of having such a comprehensive free trade agreement, because it affects India's domestic economy, so except India is signing free trade agreement bilaterally with all the countries in RCEP. So that is what here it is says, that how India has managed to weave RCEP minus China. Right? So in fact, more than 6 years after, India chose not to become part of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership's free trade agreement, because India don't want it to be part of the free trade agreement among RCEP countries. But now India has emerged in a position to secure market access benefits similar to RCEP, while avoiding significant risk of free trade agreement with China. So if India is part of free trade agreement within the RCEP, there might be a risk from China, because China may flood Indian markets with cheap goods because of its RCEP free trade agreement. But now India is bilaterally signing the free trade agreement with all 15, so total 16 countries, and India is also a member of RCEP, but the remaining 15 countries. So if you remove China, 14 countries. So with all 14 countries in the RCEP, India is having the bilateral free trade agreements. So therefore, through a calibrated strategy of bilateral and plurilateral FTAs, India has effectively created an RCEP minus China framework. Right? Now in this context, let's understand why India withdraws from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Now, as I've already told you, that Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a free trade agreement within 16 countries, 16 nations. So these are the 16 nations. So 10 ASEAN countries, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So these are 10 Asian nations plus 6 other nations. And one country is India. So Australia, China, India, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand. So RCEP means total 16 countries. The objective of RCEP that all these 16 countries will come together and they will sign a free trade agreement among themselves. But when this free trade agreement was signed by these 16 countries, so India decided not to sign such a free trade agreement with all these 16 countries. The reason is China. If we have a free trade agreement with China, then China will easily flood our markets with cheap Chinese made goods. Right. So let's understand RCEP. So RCEP comprises total 16 economies, including India. So 10 Asian countries, these are 10 Asian countries and 6 other countries. However, in November 2019, India withdrew at the final stage of negotiations of free trade agreement among the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership member countries. Right? And in fact, the government, the Indian government has given the reasons that the agreement did not reflect India's guiding principles. So that's why India is opting out of RCEP free trade agreement. However, the primary underlying concern was a near duty-free access to Chinese goods that could worsen trade deficit, because we already have a huge trade deficit with China. So this will further increase our trade deficit and it will harm India's domestic manufacturing, particularly MSMEs, and Chinese manufacturing competitiveness was seen as structurally superior, making reciprocal gains unlikely. Right? So because of these problems, India has decided to opt out of this Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Right? So I hope you have understood this. Right. So this is RCEP minus China strategy, because we have free trade agreements with almost all other countries. So we have already understood and discussed about this as well. Right. So without China, so now we have a free trade agreement with almost all other countries within the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Right. Now in this context, let's understand the advantages of the current approach. What are the exact advantages? So it will help market access to major Indo-Pacific economies, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, South Korea. And then flexibility in tariff liberalization and exclusion of sensitive sectors. For example, agriculture is a sensitive sector, dairy farming is a sensitive sector. So those sectors will be excluded. And then reduced vulnerability to Chinese import dominance, and will not face a huge trade deficit with China. If we have a free trade agreement with China, there is a probability that we'll have a huge trade deficit. And alignment with India's goal of Atmanirbhar Bharat and Make in India. Right? So making India self-reliant and manufacture goods in India. So therefore, analysts have described that this is a smart risk management strategy delivering the benefits of trade integration without systematic exposure. Right. So next important topic is, we have already understood the Thailand and Cambodia border disputes. So they have decided to sign a new truce deal. Right. So Thailand and Cambodia are Southeast Asian nations. They have been facing border dispute, and it is a long-standing conflict. It is rooted in overlapping territorial claims. So they have a boundary, but Cambodia claims some places within Thailand, and Thailand also claims some places within Cambodia. So therefore, they have a overlapping territorial claims along with the shared borders. However, there are frequent tensions, conflict along the Thailand and Cambodia border, and that has led to the military confrontations and civilian casualties of people, and even regional instability in Southeast Asia. However, recently these two countries have decided to sign a ceasefire agreement or a peace deal. Right, so this is actually signed after intense fighting, and it actually marks an important step towards de-escalation. So this is as part of the follow-up of what we have discussed earlier. Right, so as part of this peace agreement, both these countries have decided to continue demarcation of a border and not to go for a violence, and understanding each other's concerns and everything. So therefore, there will be no longer a military confrontation unless any party violates this ceasefire agreement between these two countries. Right, so that's all for today, and thank you so much. So please subscribe our YouTube channel, and thank you.